Celebrating big on Saturday. We're going to have a lot of, and if there's any protest that wants to come out, they will be met with very big force. By the way, for those people that want to protest, they're going to be met with very big force. And I haven't even heard about a protest, but, you know, this is people that hate our country, but they will be met with very heavy force.
That was our president, threatening violence against Americans who may want to protest his fascist $45 million military parade that's being thrown for his birthday on June 14th. And I'm not really sure if him repeating himself 3 times was for emphasis or due to his cognitive decline. Either way, he wants you to know that he's going to hurt you if you disrupt his birthday parade in any way, shape, or form, because your physical well-being matters less to him than his birthday celebration. But it's not just about his birthday, because now more than ever he's making it known that he won't tolerate any dissent at all from the peasants. And as you all know, he illegally seized control of California's National Guard and subsequently deployed U.S. Marines to Los Angeles to quell anti-ICE protests, and he hasn't ruled out invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807. Now, if he were to do this, it would be a drastic escalation, but I want you to know what that specifically means. Brandy Buchman of HuffPost explains, when the Insurrection Act is invoked, it suspends the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbids the military from getting involved in local or state law enforcement. Invoking the law is rare. It has occurred just 30 times in history. Martial law and the Insurrection Act are not one and the same. The Insurrection Act is invoked typically to have the military assist civilian law enforcement. Martial law refers to when the military becomes enforcers of local and state laws. So now that you know what it is, I want to explain how the authoritarians in Trump's administration are trying to bypass federal laws to weaponize the U.S. military against U.S. citizens in more insidious ways. For example, Common Dreams reports that DHS Secretary Kristi Noem is urging Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to direct the military to carry out arrests as other federal officers in DHS or ICE would. In other words, she wants to turn the U.S. military into a Gestapo-like force akin to ICE, but Hegseth can't do that because it violates the Posse Comitatus Act, hence why the invocation of the Insurrection Act is needed to suspend that particular law. But I think that she knows that the administration would face blowback if they invoke the Insurrection Act, so they're all trying to effectively grant the military the authority to arrest citizens without invoking the Insurrection Act so as to avoid mass hysteria. Either way, these fascists are cooking up new ways to quash dissent from an increasingly agitated public that's just fed up with their Hitlerian tactics. But unfortunately for them, their effects aren't having the effect that they hoped it would, because as NBC News reports, anti-ICE protests are turning into a nationwide resistance movement, with protests now taking place in 17 states and the District of Columbia, and by Wednesday they'll likely have spilled over into even more states and cities. And these protests come at a time when the Trump administration is cracking down more, with a plan to send 9,000 immigrants to Guantanamo Bay as soon as this week, and he's also vowing to expand large-scale ICE raids like the one in LA that catalyzed the protests.
In reaction to these large-scale ICE operations in Los Angeles, should people expect to see similar operations in the rest of the country?
Yeah.
And will similar protests see similar response?
As you know, we're moving murderers out of our country that were put here by Biden or the auto pen.
Actually, fuckface, you're kicking out innocent, hardworking people, including American citizens with cancer. You're the murderer. You're also a rapist and a convicted felon, unlike most of the people that you're rounding up. And I don't know why he's even pretending like he's only targeting criminals at this point, because Tom Homan just admitted that they're not doing that. Also, last week, Stephen Miller told ICE to go to Home Depots and 7-Elevens to target immigrant workers. So drop the fucking act already. We know it's bullshit. You're against all immigrants, and since the new patch for conservative NPCs went into effect recently, where they're now just coincidentally chirping about banning all, quote, third world immigration, legal or illegal, I think it's safe to say that you can stop pretending like you're only going after criminals. We know that that's not the case, but understand that this is one of many threats he's issued to Americans this week alone. On Monday, he threatened to put troops everywhere, and now he's saying that his Gestapo will terrorize even more cities, meaning that more men in masks will abduct people and throw them into unmarked vehicles under the guise of making America safe or some bullshit, even though ICE has objectively made Americans less safe. Let me show you what I mean.
This man was posing as a federal immigration officer when he walked into this car repair business right next door to the Philadelphia Police 15th District and Northeast detectives and robbed it Sunday afternoon. The man wearing a badge, blue latex gloves, a tactical vest saying security law enforcement agent with a black baseball hat and sunglasses on. This second surveillance photo shows him when he zip-tied the cashier, who told me she's from the Dominican Republic, a legal resident since 2007, and says every time she turned around to try to get a good look at the man's face, he strongly twisted her around, bruising her arm, telling her he was with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE. He came and went in this Ford E250 commercial van. He got away with $1,000. The 50-year-old victim says she volunteered to work Sunday, filling in for another worker who was sick. Still hurting a day later from being manhandled roughly, she says, and zip-tied behind her back for a while before she could get help from co-workers. Philadelphia police say it took more than 2 hours for her to get free and notify them right next door. By then, the man took off in the van out Harbison Avenue toward Roosevelt Boulevard with a 2.5-hour head start on his getaway in this very brazen robbery, posing as law enforcement right next door to law enforcement offices, which is why the victim believed he was legitimate until she saw him grabbing all the cash from the drawers and taking off.
We all knew that this was bound to happen sooner or later. When federal officers wear masks and drive unmarked vehicles and violate people's civil liberties and act unhinged, you make it incredibly easy for actual criminals to rob people simply by posing as them. But thankfully, the woman in that story was safe, but it could have gone so much worse. Imagine if you're alone and there's a bunch of masked men that approach you and they tell you that you have to get in their car. I mean, these days, you'd have no idea whether they're illegal human traffickers who want to sexually abuse you or legal human traffickers like ICE who want to detain you. But if you suspect that they're not who they say they are, they'll accuse you of resisting arrest. But if you comply and they're not federal law enforcement, then you could be putting yourself in danger by getting in the car with some violent criminal who wants to take advantage of you in nefarious ways. Everyone knew that this was bound to happen. It was just a matter of when this was going to happen, which is why, as the Miami Herald reports, a YouGov Economist poll finds that 2/3 of respondents think that ICE officers should be required to wear uniforms, and 47%, which is a plurality, don't think that they should be allowed to wear masks. But here's the thing. These ICE officers feel compelled to conceal their identities because what they're doing in many instances is illegal. Literally, they're getting violent and unhinged with people. They're violating due process rights and civil liberties. They're entering people's homes without warrants. These things are things that are illegal that could one day lead to their prosecution. Hence why they feel inclined to hide their faces, because it makes them easier to get away with the crimes that they're committing. And they're right, it will make it easier for them to get away with the crimes that they're committing, which is why we can't just commit to abolishing ICE. Every single ICE agent has to be investigated and held accountable for their potential criminality. And any Democrat who opposes the total abolition of ICE should be disqualified in 2028. And you need to make this a litmus test now, because ICE, for the most part, still has bipartisan support. And as Jonathan Cohn explains, 75 House Democrats just signed onto a Republican resolution praising ICE, including so-called resistors like Eric Swalwell and Lucy McBeth, as well as the more unhinged, genocide-supporting centrists like Wesley Bell, Shontel Brown, and Richie Torres. These Democrats are fascist collaborators expressing support for Trump's Nazi-like Gestapo force, and they should never win another election again. All of them. But I think that Democrats, they sign on to these things because they're naive and they think that it's going to make them appear reasonable when there's no reasoning with fascists. You're not going to be able to get them to bring you into the fold if you somehow make them see you as reasonable or one of them. All they care about is power and domination. That's it. And the same goes for Bernie as well, who didn't do something as egregious as them. But, he took the time to condemn violent protesters who targeted property instead of violent cops who targeted human beings. He wrote on Twitter, Dr. King defeated racist government officials and ended segregation through disciplined, nonviolent resistance. Defeating Trumpism, oligarchy, and authoritarianism requires that same level of discipline. Violent protests are counterproductive and play right into Trump's playbook. I love you, Bernie, but with all due respect, this is fucking tone deaf. Property damage is less serious of a crime than damage to actual human beings who live and breathe, which is what the cops and this administration are currently perpetrating. And if you care more about a fucking Waymo that was set on fire than, say, Nick Stern, the British journalist who had to have surgery after he was hit with a non-lethal round, then you need to recalibrate. And I'm not saying that Bernie cares more about property damage than human beings, but when he says things like this, he feeds into this narrative that we always always have to condemn the people with no power and not the people with all of the power. And I think that this knee-jerk reaction to fixate on property damage over more serious crimes like injuries to actual people, it serves fascism, either wittingly or unwittingly, and we have to stop doing it. Inanimate objects don't feel pain. People do. Waymos don't have families to go home to. People do. And performatively condemning a few violent instigators isn't going to win you any favor. I'm not saying that I condone violence and property damage and whatnot. Obviously, I'm saying that for legal reasons here on this program, but I'm not going to whine about that when actual human beings are being harmed right now. My priorities are to protect people, not property. And on the subject of Dr. MLK Jr., his peaceful approach didn't buy him any goodwill. I say this because the overwhelming majority of racist-ass Americans disapproved of the civil rights movement during the 1960s, despite their peaceful tactics, including freedom rides, sit-ins, and peaceful rallies. And as Caroline Kwan put it, there is no way to protest against fascism that the fascist powers will deem acceptable. When protest is peaceful, they respond with violence. When protest is not peaceful, they respond with violence. So ultimately, those who are siding with ICE, the cops, and the federal government believe that the only correct form of protest is no protest at all. And she's exactly right. Property damage pales in comparison to the violence being perpetrated against actual human beings, and we can never ever lose sight of that fact. So remember, violence from ICE, as well as potential warfare against Americans by the U.S. military that this administration is trying to instigate, that is the real crime here. Trump is threatening to harm or potentially kill American citizens. And at a minimum, he wants to use the military that's theoretically supposed to protect us to intimidate us. That right there is the serious crime that we cannot ignore, and I refuse to let pearl-clutching bootlickers distract us from the real outrage here, which is Donald Trump's authoritarianism, and you shouldn't let that noise distract you either.